Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. It's Prezi Illustrations here, and today I am going to be doing a creepypasta. The story that I'm reading and illustrating for you today is called A Peculiar Kind of Madness, and this story was written by Dymerski. I'd always known that my great-grandma was an orphan, but in late October of last year, she decided to tell me the truth about what happened to her and her family. We were visiting her for her birthday. It was a tradition in our household, a road trip we knew in the back of our minds we'd take only a few more times. She was turning 98, so that was just the cold, hard truth of the matter. In my childhood, the journey to central Iowa had been a fun and lighthearted affair, but now, my brother and parents could only maintain strained politeness as we met up and hit the road together. Each of us knew that this trip might be our last. For several hours, we drove through vast open farm fields that stretched from horizon to horizon. My great-grandma's house was down a narrow dirt road, off a wide dirt road, and it's also off a gravel tractor lane. As a city boy, it was more or less the more remote possible dwelling I could imagine. She was born there, had lived her entire life there, and would soon, well, you know. As we parked in an open muddy rectangle and stepped out to stretch our legs, the constancy of the place surrounded me. Every single year of my life, this house and its land had been exactly the same. The sky was open blue. The earth was a sea of waving gold, and the wind was a smooth river of cool warmth. There was never anything to mar those three pillars of sensory experience except the house, the barn, a defunct old tractor, and the bell. The bell was a simple thing, raised high on an old metal crook. It sat out in the fields about a quarter mile from the house, serving as a measure of the wind. If a storm was coming, the bell was supposed to ring, a necessary precaution in tornado country. The only problem was, the bell and its crook had rusted over long ago. Every time I got out of the family van from the age of 5 to 26, I glanced in that direction and felt a sense of unease as my gaze fell upon that decayed artifact. This time, at age 27, I looked over and saw that the bell had been scraped and polished clean of rust. It glinted in the sunlight, practically daring me to look at it. I followed my family inside while struggling with a feeling of dread that I couldn't articulate. Who had cleaned the bell? And why? I tried to stop thinking about it as we gathered in the kitchen and said our hellos. My great-grandma was making tea and shooed off our attempts to help. She was a frail woman for whom movement was difficult, but she'd never let that stop her. "The Wi-Fi password is on a note in the living room," she told us with unquestionable authority. "Go stare at your phones and the tea will be ready in a moment." My brother and I did as we were told, but my parents turned on the television instead of looking at their phones. For a few minutes we stayed in our separate worlds, only returning to the present when my great-grandma brought in the tea. And we had a nice time. That night, when everyone else was long asleep, I had to open my eyes, and I saw a glow under the door of the guest room I shared with my brother. My parents were in a different room and would not see the same light, so it was up to me to investigate. Quietly, as to not wake him, I crept out and down, finding my great-grandma still awake. She sat in her big jade leather chair, her gaze on the television. She asked me without looking my way, "You don't fall for this stuff, do you?" "What, like ads?" I asked. She pointed her thin little arm at the nearby couch. "Sit." I sat. "I'm going to tell you a family secret," she said softly, finally looking my direction. "It is for you, and possibly for your brother, but it's not for your parents. Do you understand?" I didn't, not fully, but I nodded. "You know, I was an orphan for a time, born in this house, lived with my family, but then raised by an uncle after it happened?" She didn't wait for my nod. "I was 10 years old that night, and on that night, it was my birthday." My mother had gotten me a small cake about the size of your fist. Since we didn't exactly have sweets bounding about back then, I looked forward to that cake every year. It was 11 cents, so rather expensive, but my mother got one for every one of us on our birthdays, no matter what she had to scrimp or save. All year long, I saw Mary get her cake in January, Arthur get his cake in March, Eleanor in June, Clarence in July, then Ruth a week after Clarence. Then it was months and months until me, the odd one out, on October 29th. I was so excited for that cake. As the days rolled closer, as the morning dawned and the hours inched by, I hopped around the house like a bunny rabbit, but I wasn't allowed to eat it until well after supper. I stared at the clock, so I know. Yes, that one on the mantel there, the brass and chrome one, same one. But I stared at the clock, so I know. Night fell at 6:41. That was the moment my mother rose to light a lamp. I looked up at her. Now? She smiled and shook her head. My brothers and sisters complained in a chorus in support of me, but she just shook her head at them. Too soon, and she'll ruin her supper. Father came in from the fields not long after that, dirty and tired as all get out. He ate in silence, while we chattered endlessly about what type of cake it would be. Under the frosting, who knew? It might be raspberry, vanilla, or even chocolate. We grew silent as Father neared the cleaning of his plate, an event which would mark the end of supper. 4 pieces of meat and bread remained, then 3, then 2. Any moment now. And then he stopped. He stopped at the last piece, holding it unmoving above the remaining dollop of gravy. We turned our heads, and we heard the bell. The bell was ringing out in the fields. Father grunted, then put the last piece of his food back on his plate before rising. He opened the front door. We braced ourselves for the wind, but none came. We spat on and held up a finger to the night air, then shook his head. He moved back into our lamplight and sat. "Is it going to be a storm?" Arthur asked. "Is there going to be a tornado?" Mary asked. My mother shook her head, smiled at us, and she told us not to worry. No wind meant no storm. But that bell still kept ringing. My father dipped his last piece of food in the gravy and prepared to eat it despite the constantly ringing bell, but then sighed and put it back down. He motioned to Clarence. Clarence was the oldest, so he understood. He was nearly a man himself, and tying the bell would be no problem. He grabbed a candle, protected the flame with his hand, and headed out to open the front door. My brothers and sisters and I piled up to the window, opening it. We found nothing but absolutely still, chilly air. We watched his little spot of light move out around the house and into the fields in the direction of the bell. The clanging metallic sound stopped, finally, and the candle's little flame hovered next to it for a solid minute. "Why is he taking so long to tie it?" Ruth asked. Eleanor suggested, "Maybe he's having trouble making a knot. Knots are tough after all." We watched for another minute or two before, and I know how this sounds, the little flame in the distance began to slowly rise, smoothly, straight up. We followed it with our eyes, exclaiming the entire time, and then it was out of sight, as well as Clarence. The bell began ringing again. "His knot must have come loose," Arthur said. Our parents came to look at our insistence, but there was nothing to see by then. Father motioned to Arthur. Happy to help out, Arthur grabbed a full lamp rather than a candle. He hurried out the front door, around the house, and into the fields while we watched from the window. The lamp was easier to see, and we were absolutely certain he reached the crook. As the lamplight hovered there, the bell stopped ringing. At that point, we had no reason to think anything was amiss. Maybe the wind had just blown a wisp of burning candle string up into the sky, and Clarence had gotten lost in the dark. He would see the lamplight, find Arthur, and they would both come back. The rising little flame we'd seen had just been a fluke. The only problem was, we still felt no wind at all. We stared at that unmoving light for a strangely long period of time. What was he doing out there? Was he calling for his brother? His brother couldn't have gone far. Right? Our parents looked away for a moment, and in that instant, the lamp went out. We children bleated, but by the time they glanced back, there was nothing to see. There was only darkness, and then the bell began to ring again. My father began grunting, but there were no more sons to send outside. He narrowed his eyes with thought, then handed Ruth, the oldest girl among us, our main lamp. Our mother laughed. "Ruth, be a dear and go find your silly brothers." Ruth was a little hesitant, but she accepted the lamp, leaving us in the darkness without it. She headed out around the house and into the fields. The lamp was brighter, and we could actually see her carrying hand and her white pajamas in a small lit halo. On the way there, she regularly called out, "Clarence? Arthur? Are you two lost?" About halfway to where the other two lights had stopped, her calls went instantly silent mid-sentence. "Clarence? Then, she suddenly stopped. We could still see her, with the lamp in hand, just staring straight ahead, as if she saw something. From what me and my sibling could tell, was that there was no sound in the field, nothing except that constantly clanging bell, growing faster in pace and louder in urgency. Mary Eleanor and I looked up at our parents with fearful gazes. My father shook his head, speaking for the first time that night. "So there's wind out there after all. The air is like a river inside an ocean. It's moving fast out there. I guess we just can't feel it here." My mother seemed worried, but she nodded and accepted that. We saw her accepting it, so we gulped and believed it too. We all glued our eyes to that open window. Ruth reached the bell, and in that stronger light it entered our view unmoving. At the exact same time we heard it stop ringing. Ruth looked this way and that, clearly concerned. We saw her glance at the house a few times before moving closer to the motionless bell. A half-tied rope hung from the crook, an indication that someone had attempted to tie it. But we couldn't see Clarence or Arthur anywhere near her. She put the lamp down on the ground to free her hands for tying the rope the rest of the way, but that mostly hid the light among the low-lying, recently harvested stalks. We waited. Breaths held. The air held and my lungs started to burn. At long last we were forced to breathe again. Ruth's light continued to sit there, barely visible between the broken plants. "What's taking so long?" Mary asked. "I hope she's all right," Eleanor said. Father told us, "She's fine. Damn kids are just playing a game with us." Our mother nodded in agreement. "Eleanor, go fetch your sister, will you?" Eleanor shook her head. "What? No way! It's scary out there." "It's just a game. You're not playing a game with us too, are you?" "No," Eleanor gulped. "Then go get your brothers and sisters. Tell them to come back inside now." It was pitch black out there, and almost the same inside with us, save for one lone candle. Trembling, Eleanor took our last candle and crept out into the night, scooting along the side of the house to stay as close to us as possible. Shakily, she called, "Ruth? Arthur? Clarence? This isn't funny anymore." Now it was we who sat in the dark. As Eleanor began to move further away with the last of our light, we tensed. Father eyed the open front door, and Mother softly moved to close and latch it. I wondered what they meant by that move, because how were the others supposed to get back in? But I suppose they'd unlatch it if anyone came back and knocked. Mother moved away from us in search of more candles. Through it all, the bell just kept ringing in the dark. Increasingly scared, I held Mary's hand tightly and yelled out the window, "Be careful, Ellie." She stepped closer and closer until she was a few feet away from the bell, but then she turned around in surprise and stepped closer. "Papa's wrong. See? Look!" She held up the candle to show us, and what we saw was that nothing was moving. Her hair or her pajamas blowing in any wind. I asked Father, "What's doing that? Why is there no wind?" "It's just a game," Father insisted. "They're all lying. She's just pretending to make noise, so it looks like she's being silenced." Eleanor reached the bell. Father's grip on my shoulder squeezed to nearly painful. She reached down for the lamp Ruth had left, lifting it with one hand and holding the candle with the other. She approached the clanging bell. "See?" Mary whispered to Father. "The candle's not going out even though she's not pretending." detecting the flame. There's no wind out there. But the bell is ringing, he said gruffly. So there is wind. Eleanor kept looking left and right, as if she'd heard something. Slowly, she reached the bell, which was hanging unmoving from the crook, but we could still hear it ringing, next to me. Mary began to cry. It's a game, Father said angrily. It's just a game that they're playing. Eleanor threw the lamp at something in the darkness. We saw the lamp crash, shatter, and go dark, but we heard nothing. She raced towards us, candle in hand, but the flame went out because of her haste. We waited to hear her approaching or screaming, but nothing followed. The bell continued to clang as we waited in terrified silence. Mother returned with a candle for each of us, and we sat vigil at the window. Nothing and no one moved. For hours, the bell clanged without wind. The night remained pitch black. The bell clanged and clanged and clanged, driving deeper into our ears with each passing minute. Near midnight, we broke. Father was beyond agitated. Mary, go find your brother and sisters. No, she cried. I'm not going out there. Mother glared at her. You have to. This game has to stop. Urged on by both of them, Mary burst into tears and climbed out the window. Holding her small candle, she inched out into the fields. Her sobs went quieter with every step as she stepped closer and closer to the bell. As her flame reached the bell, the ringing had stopped, and her flame snuffed out. We held our breaths. The bell began ringing again. Father clenched his fists. Go, Father said sternly. I turned and saw he was looking at me. I suddenly realized that I was the only child left in the house, and I felt horribly alone. Everything in me shrieked against the thought of going out into that cursed night. No, I said. My mother wavered in place. No longer adamantly in line with my father, she began to cry too. What are you doing? He demanded. It's just a game. There's nothing to be scared of. She screamed and demanded, Why do you keep saying that? Why have I been helping you do this? He grabbed her and shouted in her face. Because we haven't been sending our children to their deaths. That is not what's happening. She pushed his hands away and ran for the window. Pushing past me, she tumbled out and ran screaming toward the still clanging bell, not out of fear of Father, but out of fear for her children. Arthur? Clarence? Ruth, Eleanor, Mary, for God's sake, where are you? He growled and leapt out after her, yelling, We didn't kill them. Everything is fine. They both continued shouting until they approached the bell, and everything went silent, except for the bell. Twice more, it stopped ringing, and twice more, it began again. In panic and terror beyond reason, I closed and latched the window and pushed all of the furniture against every entry to the house. I curled in a cupboard, holding the last candle up to my face as it slowly melted its way down toward my fingers. I was alone. Somehow, I was alone. We had all seen the danger and stared right at it as it happened. But one by one, they'd all gone out there anyway. I'd been surrounded by a full band of siblings my entire life, and now I was completely and utterly alone in a house in the middle of nowhere. By the length of my candle, it was 3 a.m. when the knock came at the door. I trembled, but did not make a sound. The knock sounded again, 40 heartbeats later. It was louder this time. I shook, holding my candle tight. The third knock was more like a tremendous crash or kick, and I heard the door explode inward. 60 heartbeats of silence passed, and then the floorboards creaked. Slow, quiet footsteps, with long pauses in between. Something in me told me to put out my candle for fear of it being seen through the cracks in the cupboard, but I didn't dare. Not darkness. I couldn't handle darkness. I would scream if I did, so I kept that candle lit. Slow, quiet steps moved through the house. Whoever it was seemed to be pausing and listening at times. At others, they would rush forward to a random spot in a sudden frenzy and then stop abruptly. 400 heartbeats after that, the bell began ringing again. But this time, it rang from inside the house. It rang from the kitchen. It rang near the bed. It rang right outside the cupboard. 10 feet away. 5 feet away. Right up against the cupboard door. And then it opened. I sat expectantly, mouth open and eyes wide, as I waited for my great-grandmother to continue. After a bit, I realized that was it. But what did you see? She shook her head. That's not the point. I'm here, so obviously I survived, and a young man like you does not need to know what horrors walk this world outside the paved cities of man. Gulping, I asked, "You're not pulling my leg? This really happened?" Yes. Her gaze went distant by the television light. But here's what I want to tell you, and what you should tell your brother. The thing that opened that cupboard door and stared at me from the dark, the thing that hoped to wait out my candle before the coming of dawn, had a bell tied to one of its teeth with a blood-soaked rag. Somehow, some way, I have no idea how, some heroic poor soul managed to tie a warning bell to that thing before they died. We had heard that warning bell all night long, and yet my entire family walked out there one by one. We didn't listen because we didn't want to listen. My father knew what he was doing halfway, but he didn't want to accept what he had already done. So he did even worse, to continue living the lie. I narrowed my eyes. What are you saying? She grabbed my hand briefly. Fear will tell you to put your candle out, but your head will tell you to keep it lit. Do not give in to fear. You keep it lit, and you will get through this. Turning my head, I became aware of a sound in the distance. Is that the bell? I was so caught up I didn't notice. How long has that been ringing? She just clenched her fist and turned back to the television. Alrighty, so we are at the end of the video now, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. This story is called A Peculiar Kind of Madness, and it was written by Dymerski. I did make a few edits to this story, mainly more descriptive edits. But if you guys would like to read the original, then I'll make sure to leave the link in the description below. I'll also leave the socials for the author below as well. If you guys liked it, you can subscribe to see more. If you have any other creepypastas that you think I should do, then please feel free to let me know as well. Thank you guys so much for staying until the end. It really does mean a lot. And I hope you guys are having a nice day. And I will see you all next time. Stay tuned, you guys. Bye!